How far would you go if the person you love is living a double life you were never meant to discover? In today's episode, Quan's secret trips are finally exposed when his father's surveillance team uncovers his hidden life in a remote village with Tieu Lac, while something unexpected begins changing her body and their entire future starts to collapse under hidden truths. Stay with the story and subscribe for more intense drama like this. How long can someone disappear from their own life before the people closest to them start questioning the truth? Because lately, Quan has been doing exactly that, vanishing without warning, leaving the company under the excuse of business trips, disappearing from the city for days at a time like he belongs somewhere else entirely. And the most unsettling part, no one really knows where he goes. In the heart of the city, Quan's company still runs smoothly on the surface. Meetings continue, reports are delivered on time, and employees still speak of him with respect. To the outside world, nothing seems wrong. But those who work closely with him have started noticing something strange. Quan is not as present as he used to be, not just physically, but mentally. There are moments in meetings when he stares at documents without really seeing them. Moments when his phone vibrates, and instead of ignoring it like before, he steps out immediately, answering in low voices no one can hear. And then he's gone. No explanation, no clear schedule, just a brief message to his assistant. Cancel my next appointments, I'll be out of town. At first, people assume it's pressure, stress, maybe even personal exhaustion. But when out of town becomes a repeated pattern, even the most patient employees begin to whisper. Where exactly is their CEO going? The first person who truly starts paying attention is his father, a man who built discipline into the family name, someone who believes control is everything. Control of business, control of reputation, control of life itself. And right now, he feels that control slipping. He doesn't confront Quan immediately. Instead, he observes. Quietly, carefully. He notes the times Quan leaves the house earlier than usual. He notices how Quan avoids long conversations at dinner. And most importantly, he notices how every time the topic of marriage comes up, Quan becomes distant, detached in a way that feels intentional. It all comes to a head one evening at home. The dining room is quiet, the kind of silence that feels heavier than words. The table is set perfectly, but no one is enjoying the food. Trin's name is mentioned again, a familiar arrangement, a familiar expectation. She is everything the family wants, graceful, well-raised, from a respected background. In the eyes of tradition, she is the perfect match for Quan. His father speaks calmly, but firmly. You've delayed this long enough. It's time to settle down. Trin is still waiting. Quan doesn't look surprised, as if he has heard this sentence too many times before. He sets down his chopsticks slowly. I've already said it before, Quan replies. I'm not ready for marriage, and I won't agree to something just because it's expected of me. The words land clearly. No hesitation, no softness, just certainty. His father's expression tightens slightly, but he keeps his voice controlled. This isn't about expectations. It's about responsibility. You think you can avoid everything forever? Quan finally looks up, and for a brief moment, there is something unreadable in his eyes. I'm not avoiding anything, he says quietly. I just don't want my life decided for me. The tension in the room thickens. A silence stretches between them, long enough to feel like something has broken, even if no one admits it. His father studies him carefully now, not as a son, but as a puzzle he can no longer solve. Because this is not just rebellion. This is something deeper, something hidden, and that thought refuses to leave him. That night, after Quan leaves the table, his father remains seated alone for a long time. The house is quiet again, but his mind is not. He begins connecting the pieces he has been ignoring. The frequent business trips, the sudden absences, the refusal to discuss personal matters, the emotional distance. None of it feels random anymore. It feels coordinated, as if Quan is deliberately building a life that no one else is allowed to see, and that is what concerns him the most, because his son has always been disciplined, strategic, careful. If Quan is hiding something now, it means it is not small, it means it is intentional, and it means someone else might be involved. The next morning, a decision is made, not spoken out loud to the family, not discussed with advisors, a private decision made in silence. His father makes a call, short, direct. "I need someone to follow him." There is a pause on the other end, then a response. "Understood." No questions asked, no hesitation, just execution. Days later, the surveillance begins. At first, it seems simple, routine tracking, watching Quan's movements from a distance, recording where he goes after leaving the office. But it doesn't stay simple for long, because Quan is careful, extremely careful. He doesn't follow predictable routes. He doesn't stay in one place too long. Sometimes he changes vehicles. Sometimes he disappears into crowded areas where tracking becomes difficult. There are moments when the team loses him completely, not once, but multiple times. Each failure increases tension. Each lost signal feels like he is intentionally slipping through their hands. One of the observers mutters under his breath, "He's done this before. He knows how to shake people off." And that realization makes everything heavier, because it suggests Quan isn't just hiding something. He is experienced at hiding it. Then after days of pursuit, something changes, a breakthrough. Quan leaves the city again, but this time the team stays closer. They adjust, they anticipate, they refuse to lose him this time. The trail leads further than expected, out of the busy urban streets, past industrial zones, beyond the noise of the city, until the environment slowly shifts into quieter roads, and then into rural landscapes. A village, remote, calm, almost untouched. This is not a place for business meetings, not a place for corporate visits. But Quan is here, and he is not alone. From a distance, the team observes. At first, they hesitate to believe what they are seeing. Quan is not wearing the expression of a CEO here. There is no suit, no formal tone, no guarded posture. Instead, he moves naturally, casually, like someone who belongs. And beside him is a young woman, Ly Tu Tieu. They are working together in a small garden area, harvesting vegetables, carrying baskets, talking occasionally in a relaxed, familiar way. There is no distance between them that suggests formality, only familiarity, only quiet connection. They watch as Quan and Ly Tu Tieu share a simple morning meal outside. Nothing luxurious, nothing corporate, just food, sunlight, and silence that feels peaceful. And for the first time, the people watching begin to understand. This is not a business trip. This is a second life. Photos are taken carefully, quickly, from hidden angles. Every moment is documented. And when the team finally returns, they do not speak much. They simply deliver the evidence. A folder, a set of images, and a name, Ly Tu Tieu. That evening, in a quiet room far away from the village, Quan's father opens the folder. He looks at the photos one by one. His expression does not change immediately, but the atmosphere in the room does, because what he sees is not confusion, not uncertainty. It is clarity, slow, cold, sharp. He leans back slightly, holding one of the photos longer than the rest. Ly Tu Tieu is smiling in it, unaware, unprotected. And in that moment, something shifts in his gaze. Not anger, not surprise. Something far more controlled, far more dangerous. He places the photo down gently on the table and speaks in a low voice. Find everything about her. A pause. Then another instruction follows, quieter than the first. Don't let him find out. The surveillance team begins moving more aggressively after receiving direct orders. No more hesitation, No more delays, just results. They understand Quan is not an ordinary target. He is intelligent, alert, and highly aware of his surroundings. Every step they take must be calculated, clean, invisible, precise. At first, they continue tracking him as before, maintaining distance and blending into traffic patterns. But Quan makes it increasingly difficult. He does not move predictably. His routes change without warning. He stops at unusual times. He disappears into crowded intersections and reappears in places that don't make sense based on his previous direction. It begins to feel less like he is simply avoiding surveillance and more like he knows exactly where they are. That thought makes the entire team uneasy. One afternoon, Quan leaves the city again. The team follows immediately. Within less than an hour, they lose him. His vehicle disappears in dense traffic near a major intersection. No clear visual confirmation, no reliable camera angle. GPS tracking becomes unstable due to interference from urban congestion. The lead observer exhales sharply. This is happening too often. They split directions, trying to recover any trace. Minutes pass, then more. Still nothing. Eventually, a fragment appears. A blurred roadside camera captures part of a vehicle matching Quan's car. The image is unclear, but enough to identify direction and approximate route. It is not perfect, but it is enough. They regroup quickly and adjust strategy, tightening their search radius. This time, they move faster and more carefully. As they continue tracking, the environment shifts. The dense city begins to fade. Tall buildings give way to open roads. Traffic becomes lighter. Noise disappears gradually, replaced by long stretches of quiet landscape. The sense of space changes everything. There are fewer places to hide, but also fewer witnesses. Every movement becomes more exposed. And yet, Quan continues forward. The road narrows further. Maintenance decreases. The surroundings become rural. Fields, scattered houses, quiet agricultural land. A small village appears ahead, simple, calm, detached from the rhythm of the city. This is not a place associated with corporate life or business activity, and yet this is exactly where Quan has arrived. The team slows down and observes from a distance. Quan steps out of the vehicle. No suit, no formal posture. Just a simple outfit, sleeves rolled up, moving naturally as if this environment is familiar to him. He does not look out of place here. He looks settled, as if this is not a visit, but a routine. Then Ly appears. She approaches him without hesitation. There is no formality in the way they interact. No visible distance, no hesitation. She hands him farming tools and baskets. He takes them naturally without question. They move together toward a small agricultural area nearby. The surveillance team watches quietly. Quan begins working in the garden area, harvesting vegetables, carrying produce, assisting with daily farm tasks. There is no trace of the corporate version of him here. No authority, no distance, only presence. And Ly remains beside him throughout. They exchange a few words occasionally, but most of their communication is silent, familiar, effortless, the kind of silence that suggests routine rather than introduction. Later, they sit together for a simple breakfast. No luxury, no presentation, no formal structure, just a quiet rural meal. Quan sits across from Ly. He speaks softly. She responds with a calm expression and a faint smile. Nothing exaggerated, nothing dramatic, but the stability between them is undeniable. It feels like something that has been repeated many times before. A rhythm, a life. One of the observers lowers his camera slightly. This is what he's been doing all this time? No one responds, because the footage is already the answer. Every disappearance, every excuse, every so-called business trip, it all leads here. The team begins recording everything. Photos, video, multiple angles from a safe distance. They avoid getting too close. Quan still carries a sense of awareness that makes direct approach risky. Even in this quiet environment, he feels like someone who could notice a disturbance instantly. After several hours, Quan prepares to leave. His behavior changes subtly. He becomes more focused, more contained, as if switching back into another version of himself. He speaks briefly with Tu Tieu. The conversation is too quiet to hear, but the tone is calm, familiar, grounded. Then he leaves. The team follows again at a distance. This time, they do not lose him. They maintain tracking all the way back toward the city. The journey is quiet, uneventful, but heavy, because what they have just confirmed is no longer speculation. It is reality. By the time they return, night has begun to fall. The collected evidence is immediately transferred. No discussion, no delay. A folder is placed in front of Quan's father. He does not open it right away. He simply sits still for a moment, as if preparing for something he already understands will change everything. Then he opens it, slowly. Photo after photo appears. Quan in rural surroundings, Quan working in a field, Quan eating breakfast with Tu Tieu, Quan smiling faintly, something extremely rare in his official life. The silence in the room deepens with each image, but his expression remains controlled, almost unnaturally so. He stops at one photo. Tu Tieu, clear, close, unaware of the surveillance, living a life she believes is completely private. The atmosphere in the room shifts subtly, not through emotion, but through realization. He closes the folder slowly, then speaks. Keep watching her. A pause. Then in a lower voice, prepare everything we may need. Outside, the city continues its normal rhythm. Lights, traffic, people moving through their lives. But inside that room, a new direction has already been set in motion. Something quiet, something deliberate, something that will not remain hidden for long. Quan returns to the rural area early in the morning, as if nothing unusual is happening in his life. The city behind him feels distant now, almost irrelevant the moment he crosses back into this quieter world. His expression softens slightly as he steps out of the car, but it never fully drops its usual restraint. It's as if he is always balancing between two lives, never fully belonging to either. In the garden, Tu Tieu is already there. She is tending to the plants, moving carefully between rows of vegetables, her hands slightly dirty from soil, her focus completely on the work in front of her. There is a calmness in her presence that feels almost untouched by the outside world. When she notices Quan, she doesn't rush. She simply looks up and smiles. That small smile seems enough for him to relax, even if just for a moment. They start working together without needing to discuss much. Quan picks up tools and helps harvest vegetables alongside her. There is no formality in his movements here, no corporate discipline, no distance. He bends down, carries baskets, and moves through the garden as if this has always been part of his life. Tu Tieu occasionally glances at him, noticing how different he feels in this place compared to the version of him she imagines in the city. "You came earlier than usual today," she says lightly. Quan pauses for a second, then replies in a calm tone. "Work finished faster than expected." It's not a lie that can be easily challenged, but it's also not the full truth, and neither of them pushes further. As the morning continues, the atmosphere becomes more comfortable. The sound of wind through the plants, the quiet movement of tools, and the soft rhythm of rural life create a space where time feels slower. At one point, Tu Tieu brings out simple breakfast food she prepared. Nothing elaborate, just basic, warm food shared between two people who seem used to this routine. They sit outside near the garden. Quan eats quietly at first, then looks at her briefly. "You've been doing all of this alone?" he asks. Tu Tieu shrugs slightly. "It's not really alone. I have help sometimes, and it's peaceful here." Her answer is simple, but there is something behind it that she doesn't fully explain. a sense of choosing this life, even if it's not perfect. Quan nods slowly, as if understanding more than he says. There is a brief silence between them, not uncomfortable, just familiar. The kind of silence that grows between people who don't need to constantly fill space with words. Tu breaks it first. "You don't look like someone who belongs in a place like this," she says, half joking. Quan gives a faint, almost invisible smile. "And where do I look like I belong?" She thinks for a moment, then shrugs again. "Somewhere loud, busy, full of people who are always in a hurry." He doesn't respond immediately. Instead, he looks away toward the fields, as if the question touches something he doesn't want to fully define. Later that morning, they continue working. Quan helps fix a small structure near the garden area, while Tu organizes harvested produce. Their movements are coordinated now, almost naturally synchronized, as if they have done this together many times before. At certain moments, Quan pauses and checks his phone, briefly, quickly, then puts it away again. Each time, a small shift appears in his expression, like part of him is still connected to another world he cannot fully disconnect from. But he never explains, and Tu never asks. By midday, the atmosphere grows warmer. The sun is stronger now, casting light over the fields, making everything feel more vivid. They sit under a shaded area to rest. Quan leans back slightly, loosening his posture. "This place is quieter than I expected," he says. Tu looks at him. "That's the point." A small pause, then she continues. "Not everything needs to be fast or complicated. Sometimes, it's better when things are simple." Quan listens without interrupting. He doesn't agree or disagree, but his silence feels thoughtful, not distant. After a moment, he speaks again, more quietly this time. "Do you ever think about leaving?" Tu looks surprised by the question. "Leaving where?" "This place." She hesitates, then shakes her head slightly. "Not really. I've already left a lot of things behind before coming here." There is something in her tone that closes the topic without needing further explanation. Quan doesn't push it. He simply nods once. As the afternoon approaches, Quan's phone rings. The sound breaks the stillness of the moment. He looks at the screen, expression tightening slightly. It's a reminder. Something related to the city, something he cannot ignore completely. He stands up slowly. "I have to go back," he says. Tu doesn't react strongly, but her eyes follow him. "So soon?" "It's necessary." Again, no further detail. Just enough to keep distance between his two worlds. He walks with her toward the edge of the garden. For a moment, neither of them speaks. The wind moves through the plants around them, carrying a soft rustling sound that fills the silence. Then Tu stops. "Will you come back soon?" she asks. Quan looks at her for a second longer than usual. "Yes," he replies. Simple, direct, but not fully certain in tone. He leaves shortly after. The car moves slowly away from the rural area, gradually replacing fields with roads, and then roads with the distant outline of the city. Inside the vehicle, Quan sits in silence. The phone remains in his hand, but he doesn't look at it again. His mind is elsewhere, split between two lives that are becoming harder to keep separate. Meanwhile, far away from the village, the information collected by the surveillance team has already been fully delivered. And in a quiet room, Quan's father reviews everything again. This time, not just images, but patterns, timing, behavior, frequency of visits. The more he studies it, the more a structure begins to appear. This is not random. This is consistent, deliberate, a second life that has been carefully maintained. He leans back in his chair, expression unreadable, then speaks quietly to himself, almost like a conclusion forming out loud. "So this is where you've been going." And for the first time, there is no confusion left in his eyes, only calculation. After reviewing everything, Quan's father does not immediately act. Instead, he becomes quieter, more precise, more patient. Because what he is dealing with is no longer a simple suspicion. It is a pattern that has repeated itself too many times to be coincidence. He sits alone in his study late at night, the folder of photos still open in front of him. Quan in the village. Quan with Tieu Lac. Quan smiling, something he almost never does in the city. Each image adds another layer to a reality he did not expect, and yet his expression remains controlled, almost cold. Not because he feels nothing, but because he is already thinking several steps ahead. For him, emotion has never been the priority. Control has, structure has, outcome has. And now this situation involving his son has become something that needs to be understood fully before it can be handled. He closes the folder slowly, leans back, and begins to think. Not about what Quan is doing, but about what Quan is risking. Meanwhile, in the rural area, Tieu Lac continues her daily life completely unaware of anything unusual happening beyond her world. The mornings are simple. She wakes up early, tends to the garden, checks the plants, and prepares small meals. Everything follows a calm rhythm that feels stable, almost peaceful. Quan's visits have become part of that rhythm now. Not constant, but expected. Not predictable, but familiar. And that familiarity slowly builds a sense of comfort between them. But there is something subtle changing in Tieu Lac's body. At first, she ignores it. Small signs that don't seem important on their own. A slight fatigue in the mornings. A mild discomfort after meals. Moments of dizziness that pass quickly. She assumes it is the weather, or the physical effort from working outside under the sun. Nothing serious, nothing alarming. At least that is what she tells herself. One afternoon while preparing food, she pauses suddenly. A wave of nausea hits her without warning. She grips the edge of the table for a moment, breathing slowly until it passes. It doesn't last long, but it feels unusual enough to make her stop and think. She looks down at the food, then shakes her head lightly. It's probably just the heat, she whispers to herself, and continues working. Days pass. The symptoms do not disappear. They become slightly more noticeable, though still inconsistent. Some mornings she feels completely fine. Other days, she feels strangely weak without reason. But she still doesn't connect it to anything serious. Because in her mind, there is no reason to. Her life here is simple, predictable, safe. Meanwhile, Quan continues moving between the city and the village. Each time he returns, he brings a slightly different energy with him. In the city, he is controlled, focused, distant. In the village, he becomes quieter in a different way. Not cold, but more present, as if this place allows him to breathe differently. But every time he leaves, the distance between those two versions of himself grows harder to ignore. One evening after Quan leaves again for the city, Tieu Lac stands alone in the garden. The sun is setting slowly, painting the fields in soft orange light. She places a hand lightly on her stomach for a moment, not because of certainty, but because of a feeling she cannot explain. Something subtle, something unfamiliar, something that makes her pause longer than usual. Then she lowers her hand and shakes her head slightly. "No, it can't be that," she says softly, almost dismissing her own thought before it fully forms. Back in the city, Quan's father receives another update. More observations, more confirmation, more evidence that Quan's movements are not random, but structured around a single location: the village. The name Tieu Lac appears again in the report, this time with more detail. Her routines, her location, her daily activities, everything carefully documented. He read silently, line by line, without interruption, without visible reaction. But something inside his decision-making process becomes sharper, more defined, because now he understands something important. This is not a temporary escape for Quan. This is a sustained attachment, a second life that is not fading away, it is stabilizing. He places the report down, stands up slowly, walks toward the window. The city outside continues as usual. Lights, movement, noise, life. But his attention is elsewhere. Far from the city, far from business, far from expectations. This cannot continue indefinitely, he says quietly to himself. Not angry, not emotional, just final. And in that moment, a decision begins forming. Not yet spoken, not yet executed, but fully shaped in his mind. Because for him, uncertainty is something that must eventually be resolved, one way or another. Meanwhile, in the village, Tu Lac sits alone again that night. The symptoms return briefly. She presses her hand to her forehead, breathing slowly, then looks out toward the dark fields. Quiet, still, unchanging. But inside her, something is beginning to feel different. Something she cannot yet name, and far away without her knowing. Someone else is already watching her life unfold on paper, line by line, detail by detail, as if her existence has already been placed into a system she never agreed to be part of. Everything in Tu Lac's world feels normal on the surface, but her body is no longer following the same calm rhythm as before. The small signs that she once ignored are now becoming harder to dismiss. Mornings begin with a strange heaviness that wasn't there before. Simple tasks in the garden feel slightly more exhausting than usual. Even the smell of certain foods makes her pause for a moment longer than she used to. She still tells herself it's nothing, just weather, just fatigue, just a passing phase. But deep down, there is a quiet uncertainty growing inside her that she doesn't fully admit yet. That morning, she prepares a simple meal like always. The kitchen is quiet, filled only with soft natural light and the sound of boiling water. She stirs the food slowly, lost in thought, until suddenly, a sharp wave of nausea rises without warning. She freezes. Her hand grips the edge of the counter instinctively, trying to steady herself. For a few seconds, she doesn't move at all. Then it passes, just as quickly as it came. But this time, it feels different, stronger, more real. Tu Lac exhales slowly and leans back slightly. She looks at the food again, her expression uncertain now. "This is getting strange," she murmurs softly to herself. But even then, she still tries to rationalize it. Maybe she didn't rest enough. Maybe she worked too hard yesterday. Maybe it's just the heat affecting her body. She chooses the simplest explanation because it's the easiest one to accept. Later that day, she continues working in the garden. The sunlight is bright, and the wind moves gently through the plants, creating a peaceful atmosphere that contrasts sharply with what she is feeling inside. She bends down to collect vegetables, but pauses halfway when a sudden wave of dizziness washes over her. It only lasts a few seconds, but it forces her to stop completely. She closes her eyes briefly, waiting for it to pass. When she opens them again, everything looks normal, too normal. That almost makes it more unsettling. At the same time, Quan arrives at the village again. His car slows as it enters the familiar rural path. From the outside, nothing seems different, but inside, he is quieter than usual, more distracted. His mind is still partly in the city, where unfinished matters wait for him. But as soon as he steps out of the car and sees the fields ahead, something in his expression softens slightly again. This place still has that effect on him, even if only for a moment. Tu Lac notices him approaching and tries to hide how she feels. She straightens her posture, takes a slow breath, and forces a small smile. Quan walks toward her. He doesn't say anything immediately. He just looks at her for a second longer than usual. "You look tired," he says finally. Tu Lac shakes her head lightly. "It's nothing, just a long morning." Her voice is calm, but not fully convincing. Quan doesn't push further. He simply nods and steps inside the garden area with her. They begin working together as usual, but the atmosphere feels slightly different this time. Quan notices that she is slower than before, less energetic, more absent-minded at certain moments. He watches her carefully while pretending not to. At one point, she almost drops a basket, but catches it just in time. He sees it, but says nothing. Instead, he asks casually, "You've been eating properly?" Tu pauses for a second, then nods. "Of course." But there is a brief hesitation in her voice that she doesn't realize she shows. Quan doesn't react outwardly, but internally he registers it. Something is off, not dangerous, but unusual enough to notice. As the afternoon passes, they sit together briefly under the shade. The village is quiet. The wind moves gently through the trees. Everything looks peaceful from the outside. But inside Tieu, the strange sensations return again. This time, she doesn't fully hide it. She places a hand lightly on her stomach for a moment, then quickly removes it as if she is embarrassed by the gesture. Quan notices this movement. He doesn't comment, but his gaze lingers slightly longer than before. "What's wrong?" he asks calmly. Tu hesitates, then shakes her head. "Nothing serious, just a little discomfort." Quan studies her expression for a moment. He is not overreacting, but he is clearly paying attention now. Still, he doesn't press further. Instead, he simply says, "If it continues, you should rest." His tone is neutral, but there is a hint of concern beneath it. Tu nods slowly. "Yeah, maybe I just need rest." But even as she says it, she doesn't sound fully convinced, and neither does he. That evening, Quan prepares to leave again. The sky is dimming, and the light over the fields is soft and fading. He stands near the car, looking back at the garden for a moment. Tu walks him out as usual, but this time, she feels slightly more unstable than before. She hides it well, but her steps are slower, more careful, more controlled. "Will you be back soon?" she asks quietly. Quan looks at her. There is a brief pause before he answers. "Yes." Simple. But this time, the word carries a slightly heavier tone. Not certainty, but intention. He gets into the car. The engine starts, and as the vehicle slowly moves away from the village, Tu stands still, watching it disappear down the rural road. One hand rests lightly near her side again, without her realizing it. And for the first time, she doesn't immediately dismiss the strange feeling in her body. She just stands there, quiet, thinking, uncertain. Far away in the city, Quan's father receives another update from the surveillance team. This time, the report includes something additional, not just movement patterns, but a note about Tu physical condition. Unexplained fatigue, visible discomfort, irregular behavior. He reads it once, then again, slowly, carefully, and this time his expression shifts slightly, not emotionally but analytically, because this new detail changes the equation. It adds weight, it adds timing, it adds consequence. He places the report down and speaks quietly to himself. "Interesting." A pause, then he adds, "This is progressing faster than expected." And in that moment, his attention sharpens even more than before, because now this is no longer just about Quan's secret life. It is becoming something that cannot be ignored, something that is starting to evolve on its own. The village returns to its usual calm after Quan leaves, but for Tieu, nothing feels entirely normal anymore. The symptoms don't disappear the way she keeps hoping they will. Instead, they come and go unpredictably, some moments completely fine, other moments suddenly overwhelming enough to stop her mid-task. She tries to ignore it. She keeps working. She keeps telling herself it's just fatigue, just weather, just overexertion. But the uncertainty is no longer something she can easily push away. One morning, she wakes up earlier than usual. The air is cool, the light's still soft. She sits on the edge of the bed for a moment, hand resting lightly on her stomach again, without thinking. This time, she doesn't immediately pull it away. Instead, she just sits there, quiet, thinking. And for the first time, a thought forms clearly in her mind before she can stop it. What if she doesn't finish the sentence? Because even finishing it feels too heavy. Later, she prepares breakfast slowly. The smell of food rises gently in the small kitchen. And then it happens again, stronger this time, more sudden. She turns away quickly, covering her mouth as nausea overtakes her. This time it doesn't pass immediately. She has to sit down, breathing carefully until her body stabilizes again. When it finally eases, she remains still for a long moment, no longer dismissing it as something small, no longer pretending it's nothing. She looks down at her hands, then around the room. The silence feels different now, not peaceful, not comforting, just uncertain. Meanwhile, Quan's father continues monitoring the situation closely. Each new report confirms the same pattern. Quan is still traveling between the city and the village, still maintaining his double life, still deeply connected to Tieu Lac. But now there is something else in the data. Her physical condition is changing, gradually, consistently, and that consistency is what makes it impossible to ignore. He sits in his office reading the updated files again, then pauses. His expression remains controlled, but the atmosphere around him tightens slightly, because now the situation is no longer static. It is developing, evolving, moving towards something irreversible. He closes the file slowly and speaks quietly. Prepare everything. A pause, then more firmly. If this continues, we will need to intervene. Back in the village, Tieu Lac tries to return to her routine. She walks through the garden, touches the leaves, checks the soil, performs the same task she has done countless times before. But her focus keeps breaking. Her body feels slightly different now, like it is no longer fully under her control. At one point, she stops mid-step, breathing slowly, waiting for the dizziness to pass. When it does, she exhales deeply, but her expression is no longer as calm as before. That afternoon, she sits alone near the small wooden table outside. The wind moves gently through the fields. Everything around her looks peaceful, but inside her, thoughts are becoming harder to silence. She places her hand on her stomach again, this time longer, more deliberate, and instead of pulling away quickly, she just stays like that for a few seconds, as if trying to understand something she is afraid to confirm. Later that evening, Quan returns. His presence always changes the atmosphere slightly. The sound of his car approaching makes Tieu Lac straighten her posture automatically, even before she sees him. When he steps out, she greets him with a faint smile. But he notices immediately that something is different. Not obvious, but subtle. In her movements, in her timing, in the way she breathes. "You didn't rest," he says almost immediately. Tieu Lac shakes her head lightly. "I'm fine," but her voice is softer than usual, less certain. Quan looks at her for a moment longer than before, then steps closer. "Did it get worse?" She hesitates, a small pause, then nods slightly. Not fully admitting it, but not denying it anymore either. The silence between them grows heavier, not uncomfortable, but serious. Quan doesn't panic, he doesn't rush, but his attention sharpens completely now. This is no longer something he can overlook. "You should go see a doctor," he says calmly. Tieu Lac immediately shakes her head. It's really not that serious. But even as she says it, her body betrays her slightly, her hand instinctively moving again toward her stomach before she realizes it. Quan sees it. This time he doesn't ignore it. He doesn't force the conversation, but his expression changes subtly, as if connecting pieces he hasn't fully spoken out loud yet. And for the first time, there is a slight tension in his silence. Not fear, not surprise, but realization slowly forming. That night, after Quan leaves again, Tieu Lac sits alone in her room. The village is quiet, too quiet. She stares at the dim light for a long time, then slowly lowers her gaze. Her hand rests on her stomach again, and this time, she doesn't move it away quickly. Far away in the city, Quan's father receives one final report for the day. He reads it carefully, then sets it down. His expression is unchanged, but his decision is already forming completely now, because the pattern has reached its limit, and the next step is no longer observation. He stands up, walks toward the window. The city lights reflect faintly in his eyes, and he speaks quietly. It's time. In somewhere between the city and the village, two separate worlds are slowly moving toward the same breaking point, without either side fully realizing how close it already is. Quan's double life continues to deepen as he repeatedly disappears from the city under the excuse of business trips, while in reality he is secretly spending time in a remote village with Ly. At first, his unusual behavior is only noticed by a few close to him, especially his father, who begins to suspect something is being hidden. Unable to get answers directly, he orders a surveillance team to follow Quan. After several failed attempts, they finally track him outside the city and uncover the truth. Quan is living a quiet, intimate second life in the countryside with Ly, far from his corporate world. As evidence is delivered back, his father becomes cold and calculating, preparing to intervene. Meanwhile, Ly begins experiencing strange physical symptoms, unaware that her life is already under surveillance and that a major storm is approaching both of them.